Welcome to Rhetorical Report. This channel is all about leveling up your communication skills. And today we're going to do a communication breakdown of the latest Jubilee debate with Cenk Uygur. So let's check it out. And if you stick around to the end, I'm going to give him a grade based upon his performance. And you can let me know if you agree or not with that. So he started off with the first claim that Democrats and Republicans agree on economic issues and try to divide us with culture wars. So overall, his claim here was a little bit weird. The whole context of this debate was interesting because even though he considers himself to be a left progressive populist, he was arguing with both Democrats and Republicans here. And he's saying that Republicans and Democrats will agree on economic issues because of their corporate interests and the donors and the lobbyists. So he overall, in this one, it was interesting. He was pretty clear, convincing, level-headed. For the most part, he got a little hot-headed at some times. But the debaters came at him with a lot of different points. Some made some really good, interesting ones. But overall, I thought he held up pretty well. So that was the first claim. And this Jubilee debate was totally different from the previous ones in that there was no, raging lunatics. There was no people who were overtly fascist or openly hostile and racist. So that was a nice change of pace in this Jubilee debate. Now, I do wonder if that will have an impact on the virality of this one. I couldn't help but notice not as many viral clips going around. So I wonder if Jubilee is going to see that at the end of the day and change course in terms of being more outrageous and going back to the previous more negative, racist stuff, or if they're going to keep going with more reasonable debates in this one. So his first claim, was interesting, that Democrats and Republicans use cultural issues trans issues and DEI issues to put a wedge between people and distract us from the greater issues of the wealthy stealing from regular people. That was his first claim. His second one was that, so he kind of attacks Democrats and Republicans equally here, which I think is the fundamental kind of issue with him in this debate. So even though he considers himself on the left and voting with Democrats, he seems to equate them. So that seems to be a fundamental problem here. And he was kind of called out on that, I think, pretty well by this Jubilee participant. I think her name is Zena, and she kind of calls him out on the issue of, what he calls DEI. And she kind of calls out that the social justice movement made important progress in society that has also, helped out with economic issues as well. And so he kind of pushed back on that a little bit by saying that, just because, for example, if Muslims are discriminated against, that doesn't mean that they should benefit from DEI policies that might cause ultimate problems in the end. So that just seems like an ideological difference from Cenk and other progressives that he articulated here. And one thing I did notice, certainly when he was talking to the guys in the debates, he had a habit of calling everybody brother, and I found it a little bit condescending and dismissive whenever he did that. So he's like, hey, brother, look, I agree with you on this, but this is what we really need to talk about. And he would do that over and over again in a way that I found kind of obnoxious. So I would recommend him not have those little quirks of, dismissing and being condescending people by saying okay, brother, kind of a thing, where I don't know where that comes from anyways. Is that I'm in the California area. Is that something regional in another area of the States? Or is that I think about wrestling and Hulk Hogan, brother? I don't know where that comes from, where he gets that from. But it is kind of like being in the ring in this event. So that brings us to the next the next participant, Guy, who pushed back, I think, really well on Cenk's second claim that Dems are not being good faith in government. So that's essentially what Cenk is saying, that the Democrats, even though people think that they're being good, they're not really, voting on things that benefit the people. So Guy calls this out by talking about the progress that Joe Biden has made in helping, reducing child poverty in particular, and helping to expand Medicaid, I think was one of his points. And Cenk seems very unconvinced by this, but this was, I think, one of the more, the most pushback that he got in this whole entire debate from Guy here, who did a pretty good job. So Guy also, I think one of his most viral moments was calling out Ben Shapiro on immigration, and he did a pretty good job here calling out Cenk on his attacks on establishment Democrats. Okay, so let's keep it going with his next claim that Democrats only care about the rich. Okay. So Democrats only claim about the rich. I'm bouncing back and forth a little bit here. So he attacked Democrats, and he's also attacking Republicans, of course. He's not Republican. And you can, see these two guys here. One goes by the name of, one is Todd, and then the other goes by the name of, his handle was just, I think, white privilege. So you can kind of guess which side of the fence they're going to fall on here. So they pushed back on Cenk's attacks on like Republicans and Trump in particular. The guy in the purple blazer saying that not all Republicans just care about the rich, and that his like local politician that he's worked with cares about working class people. And the guy with the beard, he seemed to push back on the idea of Republicans hurting working class people, because he said he's an entrepreneur and his taxes go down under Republicans. So that was his evidence there. He seemed to be, that was his main point really. But okay. His next claim, let's keep going. Cenk's next claim, that media and money control all of politics. And here's where he got a little bit of pushback. Actually, you know what? This was on the previous claim here. I've got to call out. So these two, I got my slides mixed up. These two presenters called out Cenk directly with what you could consider an ad hominem attack. So you've got the guy in the jacket. He called out Cenk for union busting at he alleged Cenk, when his employees at the Young Turks tried to form a union, that Cenk was somehow against this. So it did come out a little bit of left field, and you could tell Cenk got really aggressive and defensive when this was brought up, and really righteously defended himself in his own eyes about that not being true. So he claimed that, when there was talk of forming a union, he wanted to make sure that it was legitimate before it got passed, and that they did eventually form a union, which seemed to counter his claim that he was like trying to prevent that. So I haven't dived deep enough into it to know where the truth lies, but in the debate, at least, I thought Cenk seemed to plausibly defend himself on that issue. And then Z, who my understanding is part of like this kind of anti-Charlie Kirk movement with the Unfuck America tour. She, I think, also has some previous work experience with Cenk and called him out for accepting corporate money, even though he's criticizing Democratic politicians for accepting corporate money. His company accepted, I think it was $20 million in corporate investment. Now, Cenk countered that by saying that it's very different investing in a small business, a media company, rather than investing in, like lobbying a politician to do the investors' bidding. So he seemed to separate those two issues. And I thought he had a fair point there. It's different when money buys politicians and politics versus money being used to invest in businesses. Now, it could be a little bit different with media, because in media, there are, interests and incentives and biases that can influence what comes out on the screen with the end product. So there you have it. And his last claim here was that media and money control all of politics. Now, this one, I think it's really hard to argue against. So I think everybody was at a disadvantage there, because I don't think it's very controversial to talk about how the media influences our political views with social media. Fox News, different platforms have, a clear, have amplify certain voices rather than others. So I think people had a hard time really arguing him on that. Certainly the aspect of like money controlling politics, that was something that's difficult to argue. So by the end of the debate, like this was like an hour and a half. They make cuts and edits in this debate. So this is like 2 hours in, and I'm really surprised how he's able to maintain his composure insanity debating for 2 hours straight. I think it's difficult to talk, for as long as it is. And so I almost felt like he wore down his opponents. And by the end of the debate, I almost felt like, whether just through just sheer persistence or just through maybe his points that he was making, that a lot of people were just kind of agreeing with him more than they were disagreeing with him. So already, I think he was generally being successful in this debate performance. He talked about like his, gold standard for for politicians would be like a Bernie Sanders type politician. But he even argued that Bernie Sanders didn't fight hard enough to win over during, his run in 2016 and in 2020. So that seems to be kind of his like ideal mold for a candidate in Bernie Sanders. Let's see what else we had here. So this guy, Austin, I just had to point out, he was interesting. It almost seemed like he was there more for self-promotion rather than engaging in the debate. So everybody's there for self-promotion. We all are. No shame in that. But he said literally that he wanted to run for office and to run for president one day. So I just found that interesting. So, hey, be on the lookout for this guy, Austin, as a Republican conservative. So see where that ends up. Okay, then we have Oliver, who I believe he started and ended the debate. He was selected. So part of the way they gamify these debates is to have the guest, the main participant, Cenk, in this case, picking out somebody to create the claim that he'll then argue against. So Oliver really pushed back on Cenk's idea that social issues are a problem for Democrats and that they're used as a wedge and should be like basically like not emphasized or focused on. So Oliver says that, social issues go hand in hand with economic issues that are important in society. They talked about Martin Luther King Jr. and how like the Civil Rights Act was important in benefiting all people, and how like gay rights is an important issue that shouldn't be compromised on for the sake of like, it might turn off some people, some voters, just even though it's the right thing to do. So here's where I think Cenk really kind of was on his back and had a difficult time defending his idea that we shouldn't like talk about social issues, because he's saying particularly that the trans issue is not important, like that transgender folks' rights to play in sports seem to be the thing that he was focusing on. But I think Oliver caught him in admitting that social issues are important when they meet a threshold of like impact on people and on a population. So Oliver, I don't think he pushed him too hard on the trans issue. Oliver seemed to be agreeing with him for a lot of this, and their difference in where they were at, I think, was more subtle rather than like a big rift in the conversation. But there you have it. In all, it was a very interesting debate. Now, this whole surrounded format that Jubilee has conjured up in the last year or two has really taken the internet by storm. These debates tend to go viral, especially when they have really extreme, hardcore right and left wing people going head to head, battling it out. So this was a little bit of a change in pace from some of their more recent and viral debates, which was, I think, much more tolerable to watch. So this one wasn't the Mediasun one, the Candace one that I watched previously is just torture to watch. This one was still, you have two people stubbornly, debating their positions in a contentious way, but it was much more interesting and useful and insightful to watch. I do get secondhand anxiety whenever you see the flags go up. I can imagine debating somebody or having an argument and then having people as soon as you pause for just a second, people just start raising flags, calling you out. There's just this very primitive tribal aspect to that is really nerve-wracking, but also makes it more compelling, I think, to viewers to watch. So in all, Cenk held up pretty good. I honestly think he's going to be convincing more people than not in the debate, even on the YouTube comments. I think more people were saying that, he did pretty good in this debate, even though YouTube does lean more kind of right populist, probably on more issues. So I'd give him a good score, a B+. So that's what I'd rate him. Docked him some points because he didn't, I think, sufficiently differentiate why social issues shouldn't be emphasized in political discourse. And he also was a little bit condescending and overly interrupting, and the use of like calling people brother I found kind of a bit of a off-putting way to talk to people. But overall, he was more convincing than not. So pretty good passing score here for Cenk Uygur in this debate. But let me know your thoughts on this. Did you find this Jubilee debate better than the other ones? What grade would you give him? I couldn't show clips in this one because Jubilee is strict about copyrighting their clips, and so I just put together this little slideshow. So let me know your thoughts about all this, and especially what grade you'd give him, and I'll see you in the next one.